I'm not a liar, not a conspiracy theorist, not a man known to exaggerate. No one's listening. I'm throwing this message in a bottle online, hoping someone relevant picks it up. If you know me, you know you have my number. Call me, let me explain. I'll start from the beginning. I'm a South Dakota boy. Came from a small community near the bend of the river by Crow Creek. Us East River folk live by a different tempo. We don't get a lot of big headlines, and we keep our dreams close enough to see them from our bedroom window. I wanted to be a cop like my dad. I followed in his footsteps, got my badge, and now I'm a cop too. Before this whole shitstorm started, I'd been doing this job for 4 years. I was no stranger to death or disease. But it's from places you expect. Some guy overdosing outside a fast food joint. A diabetic running a stop sign into oncoming traffic. We see gruesome stuff. You can't avoid that. It comes with the job, but it was never intentional. You know, it was always a consequence of bad choices or random happenstances, or plain bad luck. But one day, we got a call about something I'd been dreading. A driver called about spotting something off the road west of Wessington. We didn't get a lot of details, but me and my partner were the closest to check it out. Apparently, they'd found a head, a human head. Out there, it's all flat. No hills, just the occasional tree. Blocking the horizon, we could see this guy parked by the side of the road long before we got there. There was a couple of other people there, an old man with a bloodhound, 2 teenage boys, taking pictures with their phones, and a man in overalls that reminded me of a walking blueberry, with a sunflower patch on his chest. That was the driver, the guy who made the call, Russell, and I parked and got out. Russell's my partner, had been for about 9 months at that point. We worked well together, but we had no contact outside of work. It was better that way. The few times we'd got personal, we figured out we were nothing alike. We had vastly different opinions and experiences west of the river. Kind of folks, you know. We go up to this blueberry guy. He tilts his cap and points at the end of a fence with the butt of a cigarette. Right there. He says, "Shit's right there." He was trying to play it off as something casual, but I could tell he was mortified. There were 3 cigarettes scattered around his feet, and at least 2 of them weren't even half finished. He was shaking, bad enough to drop them. The old guy with the bloodhound had to hold his dog back. Not that it was angry or anything, but it seemed desperate to sniff the thing. And from where I was standing, that's what it looked like, a thing. Not a head, not a person. Just this pale blotch of skin lined up against a fence pole. I was stopping to talk to Chris when I saw it. The driver continued. "That's Chris." The old man raised a hand and snapped at his dog, who finally calmed down. I stepped back and called, "You guys." I barely looked. Not a peep. Russell asked the mandatory questions, establishing a timeline, asking about witnesses, what he was doing, all that stuff. Meanwhile, I asked the teenagers to step back and explain to the old man that we had to keep the area clear. I was the first one to step up close and take a good look. Someone had to confirm that it was a human head, and it was fresh young woman, maybe 20 to 25 years old, mouth half open as if letting out a long sigh. Eyes closed. Without touching anything, I took some pictures. It's important to be able to show a crime scene the way you find it. You never know when the weather takes a turn. I made a couple observations. She didn't have any makeup on, and there was not a large pool of blood or gore. The head was sort of propped up against the fence, making me think someone left it there intentionally. This was not an accident. No way. It dawned on me that I was witnessing what might be my first murder scene. Well, not a murder scene. A murder display, if anything, we called in the cavalry. As I mentioned, things like this don't happen where I grew up. Accidents, yes, but this was no accident. Couldn't be. We got a whole bunch of cars out there in less than an hour. We sectioned off a part of the farmlands to check for further body parts. We got the cadaver dogs we called to prep for an autopsy, and we had crime scene investigators on site by late afternoon. I'd never seen that kind of mobilization. Now I'm sure they wanted to bring in some expert from Sioux Falls, but time was a factor. We needed an early call on whether this death was the result of an accident animal or tool. Yes, it all pointed to a murder, but we couldn't know for sure. That wasn't our job. Before anything, we needed an initial statement. We had a coroner and a medical examiner ready. Problem was these were local guys, and they weren't prepared. Not in the least. Me and Russell were sent along to get them up to speed as a sort of go-between. We were the first to get there after all. We got the pictures and the initial statements. Also, we knew these people. That'd make things easier, Russell. And I got there just before dinner time. The medical examiner had gotten there about 10 minutes ahead of us, but the coroner was already getting work done. The medical examiner was a lady named Corin, early 40s, mother of 4. No nonsense kind of woman with a bad but honest temper. The coroner's name was Daly. Man ought to have retired by then, but he was still going at it, almost 70 years old, but as sharp as ever. When we stepped in, he was already turning the head over, making observations about the wound. Daly, Russell said, as we entered. How you? Holding up, just dandy, Daly said, making a note. I'm more worried about our friend here. Corin pushed us aside and made her way to the examiner's table. Russell got a pretty good shove and rolled his eyes at her. Since you're still looking, I take it you haven't come to a conclusion. Corin sighed. What's the verdict? It's easier to explain what it's not at this point, Daly said. The wounds are about halfway patterned, halfway something else, but it depends on the time they were inflicted. So what's the Todd? We talking days or weeks? I haven't got the slightest clue. That made her pause. There were several inconsistencies that Daly noted. For example, several of the usual markers that we see in corpses just weren't there. There were no flies or maggots, and many common shows of decomposition had either not manifested at all or manifested in an order that didn't make sense. For example, the inner lining of the mouth showed signs of advanced decay around the soft tissue, but there were no signs of bacteria or strong active smells. Daly couldn't make sense of it. Russell and I stood back and watched them work. We knew Daly had a habit of not answering his emails or checking his phone, so it was better to have some boots on the ground to keep tabs on their progress. We were all going to be on call for most of the night anyway, so we figured we'd settle in for the long haul. I took a dinner break while Russell stayed behind. He'd brought leftovers that he forgot to eat for lunch. I got an hour to clear my head and fill my stomach while they kept working. I checked in with the guys still out in the field. They hadn't found anything else. No witnesses, no footprints, no track marks, no wheels, not a thing. They were checking traffic cameras going in and out of the area, but the distances required and the amount of cars passing through made the potential numbers go up in the hundreds. I could tell it was a dead end. Hell, I could tell that just by the tone of their voice. By the time I got back, Daly and Corin were arguing. They were listing things on a whiteboard, going through them one by one, crossing things off. You could tell who'd written what. Daly had this old-fashioned cursive, while Corin kept it simple and blocky. The smell of chemicals tickled the ranch-sprinkled taste buds on the back of my tongue, making me wish I was back outside. Russell gave me a pat on the shoulder and took a break, leaving me alone with the arguing professionals. Corin was in the middle of a monologue, pointing at one thing at a time on the whiteboard. Not a hacksaw, not a chainsaw, not a, what did you say, piano wire, not a piano wire. Daly agreed. Not a knife, not an axe, and we got nothing certain. Corin continued. Not a fragment, no nothing. Daly turned to me. You got any ideas? You saw anything out there? Anything? Not a thing. I shrugged. Witness statement in the folder. This is shit. Corin spat, flipping the folder over. Not a single thing we can use. You don't think it was wildlife? I asked. Wolves, bears. We have to find some kind of baseline before we start eliminating things. It ain't, Corin explained. We can't just start listing things it's not. Well, it's better than standing here saying nothing, Daly argued. Hold on. He flipped the whiteboard over, uncorked his pen, and started at the top. It's not a wolf. He said what else they went at it for hours. Not a wolf, not a bear, not a coyote, not a bobcat, just a long list of things to exclude. They checked for fur claw marks, teeth, marks, anything. All the while Russell and I went up and down the stairs calling the chief to let him know there was nothing to report. By 8 p.m. we were running in circles. We called it a night. Corin packed up first, then Russell and I got off the clock. Russell headed home immediately, but I noticed Daly sticking around a little longer. I pretended to look for my keys as I kept an eye on him. He was still talking, but not to me. "We're missing something," he mumbled. "We're missing something big, like what I asked." He looked up at me, snapping out of whatever thought was running through his head. "I'm just making conversation. Pay me no mind, all right? You good to lock up?" Daly waved me off with a smile, and I didn't think much else of it. The next morning we got a call about feds wanting to join in on the action. I tried to get a hold of Daly, telling him to come in a little early, but the man really can't be reached by email or text. He was coming in whenever, and that was that. Corin, on the other hand, was already there by the time Russell and I pulled into the parking lot. She was leaning against a streetlight, tapping a pen against a notebook. "Not a big machine," she mumbled. "Not a small machine. Not a tool. Not a saw." "Mornin', Corin," Russell yawned. "Trying to get some work done before the feds get here." She ignored. "U.S. We'd gotten the spare keys to open Daly. Got the other pair. Corin wasn't usually the one we called for these kinds of things. Then again, we'd never had this kind of thing. Not really. The moment Russell clicked the lock open, Corin shoved her way past him, this time with even more force. It was enough to make Russell go, "Hey," but she had no visible reaction. She kept mulling over whatever list she'd made on her notebook. She was eager to get back to it. We only had about an hour or so before reinforcements would come knocking on the door. Corin wasn't wasting any time. She ran down the stairs, put on the bare minimum equipment, and rushed to pull the slabs out. We barely had the time to keep up with her, like she was racing against the clock. But when she pulled the slab out, there was a whole other problem. The head was gone. Russell stood there, mouth agape. He snapped out of it the moment Corin turned to us, her eyes sunken and red. Something was off. She'd always been a bit short and snippy with us, but this was something else. I don't think Russell saw it, but I could tell she was up to something. She looked from him to me, and then at the door. "Not a little girl," she mumbled. "Not an old lady, not a teenager. You all right?" There, Russell asked. "You slept okay?" I could tell she wasn't listening. There was something about the white of her eye that bugged me, a sort of micro-twitch, like a nervous dog, when she suddenly burst into a sprint. I was ready, Russell, wasn't I? Stepped in front of her, and she ran straight into me. She knocked herself to the ground, landing face first on the hard floor. I could hear the air pass from her lungs in a huff. I got a pretty nasty landing flat on my back, but nothing was broken. A bad bruise, but I got lucky. Russell was on her back, within seconds putting her in handcuffs. "Not a snake bite," Corin mumbled. "Not a hound, not a house cat, not a gunshot. What the hell?" Russell gasped. "What's wrong with you?" "Not a thing wrong, not a question." Answered, "Not a long way to go." Corin. Russell yelled, "You hear me?" I was already calling for another squad car. Time was of the essence. We had a missing head, and Daly wasn't around. I prayed to God he'd just overslept, but I had this sinking feeling in my gut that he hadn't. There was something about the way he'd lingered the other night that made me think he might have done something he shouldn't. Another car was sent to check on Daly, but he wasn't at his apartment. Another car went to check his office, but there was no one there either. We ended up combing through whatever contacts we thought might be useful. Russell and I had our coffees, making mental lists out loud. His ex-wife, I said, "I know he got one of those." "I don't think. He made it to Florida overnight. His car's still in the driveway. So not a ex-wife," I said. Nada ex-wife Russell agreed. Not a chance. Nada AI turned to look at him as he tapered off. He stared at the steering wheel coffee hanging limp in his hands. His eyes glassed over, and I could see a bubble of spit pooling in the corner of his mouth. He wasn't blinking Russell. He blinked, dropping his coffee straight into his lap. It wasn't that hot, but he was up and about within less than a second. Cursing like a sailor, he kicked the cup down the street like it owed him money and got back in the car, wiping the seat and his pants with a blanket from the glove box. "You okay? Not about to get sick?" "Not now, you sure you seem out of it. You really think Daly stole that damn head?" Russell said, changing the subject. "You think he'd do that?" "He could have. I mean, it's possible. What's the odds of them both disappearing without him being involved? Not a snowball's chance in hell." "Exactly. Not." A chance. I gave Russell another look. He was clearly thinking about something, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I tapped him on the shoulder and handed him my coffee. "I think you need this more than I do. I'll take the wheel for a bit." We spent most of the early day driving around town asking questions. We had a couple of vague leads, but it's like we were spinning tires stuck in the mud. Russell was getting frustrated, so the chief asked us to do something else for a bit. They were busy, dealing with the feds anyway, and they had 4 different squad cars out looking for Daly. We were sent to check on a roadside diner, old folks kind of place that had been closed all day, and the waitress working the lunch shift was getting worried. The owner wasn't answering their phone, and there'd been no notice ahead of time. There was just a note in the window saying closed. It wasn't a high priority call, but it gave us something to do. That is, until I noticed something curious. We went to check up on the place before we headed to the owner's registered address for a house call. But when I got a closer look at the sign, I noticed it was written in a beautiful cursive. I elbowed Russell and pointed. You see that he nodded, moving. And to get a closer look, not a common thing around here. Russell said owner's got arthritis. You don't think he wrote that? Not a no. He coughed. Now that I think about it, I think I've seen Daly around here before you have. When? Not long. Russell trailed off, falling silent. I gave him a couple of seconds. This time I wasn't going to snap him out of it. I wanted to see what was going on. He stood there for a full minute. I counted. It was a full minute. Then he almost toppled over, tipping forward like a falling tree. That's when I rushed to catch him. If I hadn't, he'd have gotten a face full of gravel. He immediately went on the defensive, straightening his back out. I'm okay, he insisted. I'm okay. You gotta talk to me? I'm okay, whatever, I'm okay. Not a stop saying that. You keep saying that, and you zone out. Saying what I blinked. I didn't want to say it. There was something dangerous in it, like turning a key to a door you didn't want to open. I shook it out of my head and headed for the car. Before I got halfway, Russell was going around the back. He wasn't about to wait. He was heading inside with or without me. I had to stop whatever I was doing to catch up with him. I called out to him, but he was heading for the back door. Before I got to him, he'd cracked a window and shoved the door open. He was rushing inside with the same urgency that Corin had, except I wasn't there to tackle him last thing. I saw before he rounded the corner was him pulling out his gun. I called out for backup. As I ran after him, I stopped dead in my tracks a couple steps. Inside the kitchen, the owner was on the floor face down in a pool of blood. You could smell death on him. Russell had stepped over him, heading straight for the front of the diner. This wasn't like him. Russell was not a hothead, not a thrill seeker. If anything, he was the controlled one. Russell, I called out. Gotta step back, backup's on the way. There was no answer. Instead, he rushed straight to the front and stopped. I followed him, rounding the corner. The blinders were shut, casting the whole serving area in a gray shade. A couple streaks of sunlight made their way through the shutters, lighting up the white spaces with spots of red. Daly had been busy. Without a whiteboard, he'd been writing on the furniture with whatever pen was closest. Turns out that pen was blood. The first few sentences seemed familiar. Not a cougar, not a lion, not a panther, not a gator, more animals. But the further in you got, the text got smaller, more concentrated. And the sentences grew stranger. Not a lot, not. A little, not a lord, not a queen. Then at the far end, there was something written on a table. Russell was already there, picking something up from it as I got closer. I saw the text while trying to keep an eye on my partner. The text was cleaner underlined. Not a person. Not a person. Russell nodded. Yeah, that makes sense. What's that you're holding? I asked. What are you doing? He dropped his handgun to the floor and cradled something between his hands. As I got closer, I saw what it was. The bottom jaw of the missing head torn loose. Not a person, Russell repeated. Not a threat? You ought to put that down. We got people coming any second. He looked up at me elated, this immense sense of relief spreading over his face. It's not a person, he repeated. It's... Okay, not a person. Not a corpse. What's not a corpse? He held up the jaw, looking me in the eye, and without looking away, he put it up to his lips and bit off a mouthful. It didn't make the sound I thought it would. Instead, there was a soft, mushy kind of noise, like someone biting a jelly-filled marshmallow. He barely chewed for a second before he got another chunk. He said, mouthful, itch fine. Not a Persian. I kept shaking my head, backing away. I didn't even notice I'd pulled my gun. He held the flesh out to me, looking like I'd said something hurtful. Try it, he smiled. Try a little? No way, I said. I had to stop myself. I had to physically stop myself. Thinking about this sentence made my head spiral into a pattern of repetition over and over again, like an allergic reaction in the back of my mind. I slapped my hands over my mouth, smacking my front teeth with the metal of my gun. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't shoot Russell, but I couldn't stay. I turned away. I hadn't noticed the bathroom door opening, the one in the back near the grill, and I hadn't noticed Daly waddling out of it. Turns out he'd had a meal of his own. He'd eaten most of the head. Hair was still hanging out the side of his mouth. His glasses were clinging to the tip of his nose. A single good shake from falling to the floor. In the dark, his hands looked black rather than bloody, but you could tell from the smell. I ran straight into him, almost knocking him over. He fumbled his steps a little, leaned back against the wall, and braced himself. It's okay, Daly burped. It's not a person, not a corpse, Russell added, not a soul. I could hear myself finishing the sentence. I was just a syllable or two away. I wanted to say it was not a person too. Not a problem. Instead, I pushed past Daly. I rushed forward, leaping over the dead body, and threw myself out the back door. I got a good 10-15 feet out past the door before I looked back. Daly and Russell were both standing by the door looking at me. They weren't chasing me off or trying to talk me down. They just stood there mumbling the same pattern, the same rhythm. They couldn't figure out what the hell this thing was, so they were just listing things it wasn't. Not of this, not of that. Then I heard something, a dragging sound, and I realized they weren't looking at me. They were looking at something behind me, something cold and mucus-covered wrapped around my eyes like wet seaweed. I screamed, but that only served to open my mouth. Something cold got pushed in past my tongue, tickling my tonsils, and I swallowed. I choked as something bitter and meaty swirled down my gullet. It felt like someone had thrown a sack of bricks off a tall bridge, landing hard in the bottom of my stomach. I fell forward, gasping for air and scraping my knees. I was dry heaving to get that thing out of me. My eyes were covered in grease, and all I see is this figure. It emerged from behind me, moving past me. I barely saw the shape of it, but it had something like a big arm coming out of its side. It looked like a big corn cob, but instead of kernels, there were pieces. There was the shape of a foot, a hand, long hair from a drum scalp. As it moved past me, Daly and Russell silently joined it. Before they disappeared down the northern field, I heard something snap and tumble to the ground. I got to my feet. Stumbling, I made it to the bathroom. I shoved fingers down my throat. But no matter what I did, nothing came of it. Something was stuck in the pit of my stomach, and by the time backup arrived, I was sobbing on my knees, bent over a bloody toilet seat. I was screaming into the porcelain, begging for whatever was inside of me to leave. But it didn't. They had to drag me out by the arms. It didn't get any of it out. Not a piece. Not a little piece. Not a single little piece. They didn't find Daly or Russell. I ended up with a 2-night stay at the hospital. Apparently, something similar happened to Corin. She'd had a breakdown, and they were still trying to figure out the problem. Some signs pointed to a fungal infection, but they couldn't find the cause. The doctor determined that it was not a virus, not a bacterial infection, not a misfolded prion. They had to put her on N4 as they couldn't get her to shut her mouth long enough to eat. They were still trying to figure me out when I got sent home. They said I wasn't as far gone. Paid leave 3 weeks. 3 weeks turned to 6 as the test results came back inconclusive over and over again. At one point they thought I had some kind of contagion, but they couldn't say for sure. Someone mentioned narcotics, but it just turned into a long list of negative tests. I switched doctor 3 times as they kept tripping over their own diagnoses. One of them ended up taking their own sick leave after a while. I've been trying to figure out a way to get rid of this. I sit up at night staring at the wall, drawing on my cheap wallpaper with a black pen. I want to help them. I want to figure this out. I write what I know to be true over and over. It's not a threat, not a person, not a human, not a corpse. I had to give myself a reason to write. Again, I've been trying to resist it for so long. It's like whistling a song that you know you can't stop humming. If you start, it'll be on your mind all day, but I'll just do it. I'll do it until I get it out of my system. I don't care. If it takes days or weeks or months, I'll figure it out. I'll get it out. And once it's gone, I'll be back here to figure this out. Not a day, not a week, not a month, not a year, not a threat, not a person, not a killer, not a beast, not a thing, not a not. This is my final testimony. I stand trial for medical malpractice, the breaking of my Hippocratic oath, and deception of the greatest degree. I am not tried in any earthly court, but one of my own making. I am both plaintiff and prosecutor. I am my own judge, jury, and executioner. I already know what my sentence will be, but before I carry it out, I must bear witness against myself. I was a doctor. Before today, I was employed at V Hospital in C. I was chief of pediatric oncology. The beginning of my end occurred almost 10 years ago on a cold November night. I had just been appointed to my position as an oncologist and had undergone my first major tragedy. A 6-month-old infant passed away in my care. Leukemia. In my field, the death of a patient is common. However, at this time, it was not yet common to me. This was the first child that had stopped breathing on my watch. Do you know what that's like? To watch a child suffer because its own body has turned traitor. To hear their labored and pained breathing. To smell the stench of decay in a living being as they fight against forces that have turned healthy marrow to poison and filled their blood with mutant offspring of an insidious creation. And you watching it all filled with knowledge and learning that brought us as a species off the face of the planet and into the stars, powerless to stop the natural march of the body as it runs itself into the disturbed dirt of an open grave. I am no man of religion, but I have seen the devil in the face of carcinoma. I took the loss of this child hard. My skin was thin, with none of the psychological protection my colleagues had accumulated over the years. Staring at the pale and still body of my patient, I remembered my own son, only a year old at the time. My heart leaked its grief to every extremity. Logic said I had done all I could, but this was a lie coated in sentiment. How could I practice medicine if I were to admit in the face of death that my skill was useless? I left the hospital while the baby's parents still grieved around the body. I walked the streets trying to lose myself in the never-ending backgrounds of concrete and brick that constituted my city soon. I was soaked through with ice. Cold rain. My psyche dripped out in clumps through my clutching fingers, even in my altered state. I knew I had gone too far into despair. I thought I would never return from it. But in a moment of unexpected clarity, I came back to myself. I wiped my cheeks of water and salt. I comprehended my surroundings. Unfamiliar buildings rose up on either side, swallowing me in their deep and angular shadows. I could no longer see the street. I supposed I was in an alley between alleys, a foreign place. From my usual and well-trodden haunts, it was quiet here, soundless. As the seconds gathered, I realized I didn't remember how I had arrived there. I saw a figure at the end of a narrow passage. It was a man, and he was unremarkable in every aspect. His form blended into the building he leaned against, and he seemed only a smudge against the brick. His clothes were ragged, his face neither handsome nor excessively ugly. As I tried to place his features, they blurred, melting together like a liquid. Veil were being poured over my eyes. I did not want to approach him. If I had not been in such a state of distress, I would have left the moment. I saw him, not sparing a second glance, but I allowed myself the indulgence of another look, and it was in the turning of my head that my damnation was sealed. The man stared back at me with coppery pupils. They reflected the meager light like a dog's eyes in the dark. Something within those orbs cut through my shirt and skin. It was as if my exterior were stripped away, and the darkest essence of my being were laid bare like a book. Somehow, I knew he read my shame with sympathy. I moved in his direction with slow feet. Once I was close enough to smell him, to hear his breathing above the patter of rain, I spoke. "Who are you?" The man did not answer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a vial. Inside was a clear substance, slightly viscous, like oil. He opened the cap and held his finger over its mouth. He produced a pin in his other hand and pricked the pad of his index finger. A drop of blood spilled over the edge of his fingerprint and into the vial, clouding the liquid in twisted and insinuative patterns. The man shook the mixture, and it congealed into the consistency of pus. He extended it to me. He cleared his throat. Raspy tongues of phlegm blasted away by the inner convulsions of his soft palate. It seemed his throat was more accustomed to smoke and smog than words. But after the cacophony, the words did come anoint. "And they will live." I stared at him. I had dismissed God as superstition years ago. Miracles at best were unknown principles of the natural world that still hid behind the curtain of ignorance. I was not a believing man, but in that alley, I allowed myself that weakness. Entertaining the ramblings of a wet homeless person who smelled of dog seemed harmless compared to the insanity that waited at the edge of my subconsciousness. With an empty mind and numb fingers, I reached out to take the vial, but before my fingertips could brush the glass surface, I stopped. How does it work?" The man coughed again, a spluttering noise like a dying car. "A price is paid, a price." What he met my gaze with his coppery stare, one befitting. My eyes went back to the vial. Years from that moment, lying alone in the gloom of a dark bedroom, I would lie to myself and say I did not know what he meant, that I could not have known. But I did. I knew then, and I know now, that there is only one thing worthy of the priceless gift of life. The rain smacked the ground around us like 1,000 heartbeats. I remembered the flat line of the infant that had died only hours earlier. The sustained wail of the machine reverberated in my skull like a recited prayer. After a moment, I took the vial, cradling it loosely in my fingers. The man's voice became soft. "Tell no one, or the debt will fall to you. Not everyone understands the price of miracles." Without a backwards glance, the man turned. He walked down the alley, then vanished around the corner. I stayed still. The rain cooled my fevered skin. I wiped my hand over my face. Something shifted, and in another moment, I was on a familiar street, walking back towards the hospital I thought I had been, subject to a hallucination, a physical manifestation of my mania. But I felt the unblemished glass of the vial in my pocket, and my heart was torn apart with a strange opposition of dread and longing. It was weeks before I used my new gift. There was another child, this one 4 years old. The cancer had gotten into her bones at night. She woke the entire ward with her screams of pain. We subjected her to surgery, chemo, radiation. We filled her body with poison until it was pressed against the threshold of death. Still the tumors rose up again, one after the other, like depraved parodies of Christ. She was nearing the end. It was time to tell the family to say their goodbyes. But before I did, on the last evening of her treatment, I went. To see her, I was there, making sure that she had received her regular dose of morphine. I saw her small and drawn face. Her bald head was dotted with sweat like dew. Her body, shuddering, draped across the bedspread, was sorrow incarnate, I remembered. The vial, I wish I could confess that I fought to convince myself that I had to go over some ethical grocery list before I took the vial out of my pocket. But there was no moral struggle. Her face, her pallid and bruised in starving form with collarbones jutting out from her skin like axe blades. Such an image was an all-consuming counter-argument. I took the vial and unstopped it. The room filled with a cloying smell like berries rotting in milk. I spilled one drop of its substance onto her forehead. The fluid sank into her skin like a gas. Her face relaxed. For the first time in 2 years, she slept without the aid of opiates. The next day she woke with bright eyes and greeted her parents by leaping from the bed and running to embrace them. Wept at the miracle, confused, terrified, but altogether grateful. They celebrated. As I watched the scene of joy, I contemplated other things. I pondered how in another room of the hospital that night, an old man had died suddenly of heart failure. I read the report myself. He had no family record of heart problems, no such previous issues in his history. He has been admitted for forgetting to take his diabetes medication and having a higher than average blood sugar. They were keeping him overnight, strictly as a precaution, nothing more. He was 60, pushing 70. He had a wife and 5 children. In the same minute, perhaps the same second, I had poured out the vial on the child. His heart had ceased beating. What would you have done? How was I supposed to reconcile the image of the young child, whole and healthy, with the image of a circle of siblings mourning their father as his casket was lowered into the ground? I attended the funeral from a distance. I told myself it was penance, but now I worry it was reassurance. I left that bleak gathering with resolve, not regret. I told myself that the old man probably would have lived for only another decade. 10 old years exchanged for a lifetime of health. This was fair. Slowly I found myself making more nightly visits to the sick. Children in our unit. I went to those near death, those who had not responded to treatment, those who grimaced in sleep with the pain of growths consuming their insides and pushing against their internal organs. Their recoveries were explained by the hospital as unexpected turnarounds attributed to some latent effect of a new experimental treatment, or a thing equally esoteric. It is strange how we humans will explain away miracles, as if the thought of cosmic intervention is somehow more terrifying. I am ashamed to say, I reaped the benefits of my healings. I accepted one promotion after another, telling myself it was for the greater good. I would donate my extra salary secretly to charitable causes, but it was an empty gesture. I should have stopped, refused, but it was not long until the entire unit was under my purview. And as the number of my patients increased, so did the bodies in my wake. I kept track of the names of my victims at first. I remembered their faces, their histories. As the list mounted, the weight became too much. I turned a blind eye to them. I let their identities slip from my thoughts. Most serial killers keep trophies. My only remembrances were empty spots in my memory, deliberately kept bare, unexplained deaths, accumulated in the hospital, Never enough to prompt investigation, but enough to inspire superstition. I saw nurses start wearing prayer beads and doctors refuse non-essential patients based on nothing but a bad feeling I could not see at the carnage. I wrought all I could see were the faces of the children who now lived and breathed free of sickness and torture. When I could not sleep for guilt, it was their faces that allowed me to rest. Yes, the children lived, but I was still a murderer. It is strange how life moves on, even in the presence of evil. In the shadow of the hospital, my family grew. I watched my son mature and my wife, and I welcomed another boy into the world. I loved my children equally, but the complicated reality remains that even the best parents have favorites. My older son was mine. He shared my intellect, my interest in medicine. At first, it manifested in a simple curiosity of my stethoscope. It grew into him reading medical textbooks the moment he could sound out words. It was all unintelligible to him. I'm sure he only looked at them for the pictures, but nothing gave me more pride than to watch him turn the thin pages. A look of concentration on his young face, still lined with baby fat. He was 10. When he collapsed for the first time, it was my other son that found him. He was only 4. He came to me, his face red with effort, and tears already soaking his shirt at the throat. He was the quieter of the two, but I still remember his wails as he begged me to come downstairs. He fell. He clutched on my leg, the reverberations of his sounded fear echoing in my bones. I pushed him off and ran down the stairs. My feet stumbled, and I almost broke my neck in a tumble. I righted myself and went searching for my son. I found him on the living room floor. He was face down on the carpet, his arms twisted. He wasn't moving. I ran to him and checked his pulse. It was there faintly, but he wouldn't wake. Blood leaked from his nose, smashed in by his fall. I fumbled with my phone and called an ambulance. In the background, his brother continued to howl, begging him to open his eyes to be okay. The doctors didn't know what caused it. After we arrived at the hospital, and after every test had been performed, all my colleagues could do was shrug their shoulders. They managed to rouse my son from his unconsciousness, but he was lethargic and weak. After a month of observation and experimentation, all they could tell us was that his blood was failing. The red cells were tearing apart at the seams, keeping oxygen from getting to his brain. They didn't know what to do. We went from hospital to hospital. We tried every experimental treatment known to man. His younger brother donated blood, plasma, and even marrow once we found him to be a good genetic match. His generosity was in vain. It all was nothing worked. My son was dying, and there was nothing I could do about it. And it was in that hopelessness that I thought of the vial. Again, I had refused the thought before I would not corrupt my family with its use. But that little vial grew heavier by the day in my pocket. I held on to hope in the medical system, gripping to it so tight until it felt like my fingernails were coming off at the quick. Each time my hand brushed the container's glass surface in my pocket, I felt the notion of some great evil hanging over my head, suspended by a single thread. No, I would not toy with the idea of cutting that string. I would see my son made well, but I would not resort to murder to do so. But after a doctor, the last we would see, instructed us to bring our son home, giving us nothing but a prescription for a bottle of liquid morphine. My convictions shattered, do you see? They were leading my son to die. Do you see that I had no other choice? Do you understand? That night I crept into his room while he slept. In the dark, I heard thrashing his brother, who slept above him in the bunk bed my wife and I had built years before, had experienced night terrors ever since he had seen his brother collapse. I heard his whimpers, and they festered in my ears. If I had any questions regarding what I was about to do, they were wiped away in an instant. The sounds that came from my little boy echoed my pain. It all needed to end. I stood over my sleeping older son, his face contorted in half realized pain. It had been hours since his last spoonful of drug. I dug the vial out of my pocket. Somehow, after all my use, a small portion remained. I unstopped it then held it above his head. I allowed a drop to fall. The liquid descended and splashed on his forehead. Then it was gone. My son went from pain to peace in a moment. His face relaxed, his shoulders loosened. For the first time in a year, I saw him pass to untroubled sleep, breathing deeply. I sat down at his desk chair. I watched him rest for a long while. For a small moment, I felt relieved. But in the sounds of my older son's untroubled breathing, I heard something. Else silence. My younger son no longer thrashed in his bunk. I stood and went to him. He was so still. I touched him, and he was cold. I reached for his neck, grasping for his pulse. I pressed deep into the soft flesh, but there was no beating underneath. My fingertips, I cannot remember the hours that followed. For those I must rely on the account of others. My son told me. He woke to me screaming the sound somewhere between the void of death and the inferno of agony. He thought I was dying. My wife had been dealing with medical bills in the kitchen. She heard my pain as well. She told me she rushed into our boy's room and saw me cradling the lifeless body of our youngest, begging for him to wake up. Paramedics arrived and declared him dead. At the scene, the autopsy revealed it was a freak brain aneurysm. The funeral came and went. It was only at the reception, when I was shaking limp hands and hearing whispered condolences, that my mind began to point the finger of blame. The investigation was short, with only one true suspect. The full implication of my actions were upon me, and I wanted nothing more than to hear a pronouncement of punishment. And because no earthly court will give me my just dues, I have taken this duty upon myself. I have destroyed the vial. I expected something so powerful to put up more of a fight. Instead, all it took was a hammer. I poured the liquid and glass into a trash fire in an alley. Perhaps it was the same alley where I met the man, though I cannot say for sure. Watching it burn, I feared that I would press my hand against my pocket and feel its oblong-shaped hole once again. But the cloth remained smooth, and the space empty. I will be dead soon. The doctors will claim an unexpected thrombosis or embolism, a small twitch of muscle or leak of blood that will put a stop to my beating heart. But in truth, it is my honesty that will have killed me. The man in the alley warned me that if I confessed, I would pay the same price as my victims. He was telling the truth about the vial. I can only hope he was honest about this too. Thank you, dear reader, for your help. In your curiosity, you have seen justice done. In receiving my confession, you have allowed the axe to fall. Do not let it weigh. On your soul, I am guilty. You have done the world a service. To my son, if you find this, I am sorry. I am sorry for what I have held you party to. This is not your fault. My soul is stained trading your brother's life for your own. But your soul is whole. Remember this. I beg of you, please do not follow me to where I go. I don't know what awaits me, but I know there will be no forgiveness. I do not seek for it. I will pay my debt, and that will be enough. Asterisk, sometimes my bedroom door doesn't lead to the hallway. Usually it does, on most nights. I can get out of bed, walk out the doorway, and go to the bathroom. No problem. I can wake up, get dressed, and go to work without issue. Most of the time, but on March 2, 2011, I was rudely awakened by the howling of a pack of wolves that were prowling the forest outside my room. They didn't come in, and I didn't feel threatened by them, just extremely confused. I smelled the sap of the trees and the rain-drenched dirt. I could feel the wind whipping between the branches and through the doorway. The wolves didn't seem to notice me, and I blinked, rubbed my eyes gradually, and stared out into the hallway dimly lit by the nightlight. I would have assumed I was dreaming or hallucinating, were it not for the traces of damp dirt and leaves that had been carried into my bedroom by the wind. Anyway, it continued like that for a while. Sometime in 2017, I got home after a long day at the office and trudged upstairs. I walked past the nightlight I'd long since outgrown and approached the doorway to my bedroom. The blazing sun beat down on me from the desert within. I sighed and went back downstairs. It had become pause at this point. I knew my room would come back eventually, so I just went to sleep on the couch. Sometimes it was worse than others. There was one night early in 2019 that I nearly drowned as my door suddenly led to the bottom of the sea. A torrent of briny water rushed in and swept me out. Of my bed, I heard sparks and shattering glass as the waves crashed over my knitstand, and I was barely able to take a deep breath before going under up was down left was right. Everything was chaos. And then I was back on the floor of my bedroom, peeling kelp and a starfish off my sopping forehead like some cartoon character. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. It went on like this for years. Every so often my doorway just became some sort of portal to somewhere else. I was almost never in any sort of danger, and I never mapped out any sort of pattern to the timing or locations, so all I could do was hunker down and let it pass. It rarely lasted more than a few minutes, but last week all of that changed. I was fast asleep when suddenly an agonized scream pierced the air. I jumped to my feet in a cold sweat. I'd never heard anything like that before. My eyes slowly, hesitantly panned over to the doorway. I expected to see a mental asylum or triage operating room or something. Instead, what greeted my gaze was a vast gray, craggy plain suspended over an abyss of blood-red stars. Periodically, a star began to vibrate rapidly, then fold in on itself, emitting yet another impossibly pained scream. In its place was pure inky blackness before eventually this canvas of unreality appeared to bleed a new star into existence. With some trepidation, I stepped toward the doorway. I had no idea what this place was, but I felt it calling to me. Are you familiar with the call of the void? It's a phenomenon where people standing over cliffs' balconies and the like suddenly feel an urge to jump, even if they're not remotely suicidal sometimes, followed by an intense sense of panic and remorse. This felt similar. I had no desire to enter this hellish abyss, but I also felt myself inexorably drawn toward the entryway. I couldn't stop my legs from walking closer and closer. My ears began to ring with a bizarre chittering noise, indistinct whispers that frighteningly almost made sense. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. It was cold, colder than I'd ever felt before. It almost seemed like whatever unseen force was drawing me into the abyss was pulling all warmth and light out of my room. I shivered and took another unwilling step. As I approached the door, an arm shot up from below my field of view. An emaciated hand gripped the bottom of the doorway and clawed desperately for purchase. Its muscles flexed as it attempted to pull its unseen body up. I froze. I had no idea who or what this creature was. I didn't know if it was human, if it meant me harm, if it was a victim or a perpetrator, and before I had a chance to even process that the door returned to normal, my standard hallway was back. The only evidence of that hell was the creature's severed fingers lying at my feet, the grisly sight dimly lit by the nightlight that had become my anchor to reality. Every other time the doorway shifted, it went to somewhere easily identifiable. I don't know what's causing it or where these areas physically are, but they logically make sense as a space on this earth. But that place was an impossible nightmare realm. If talk to scientists, priests, professors, psychics, the crazy old guy who runs the Curiosities shop on Grand, no one seems to have the foggiest what's going on, or why the phenomenon is isolated to my bedroom door. Almost none of them believed me to begin with. All I know is that I've signed the papers to sell the house, and it's slated for demolition. At first it was a relief, but then it hit me. What happens if the phenomenon occurs again after the doorway is reduced to rubble? I've worked as a cemetery groundskeeper for 4 years now. Hillrest Memorial Garden's about 60 acres old enough that some of the headstones are barely readable anymore. Most people think that kind of job would get to you, but it never did. Night shift is quiet, peaceful. Even the dead don't complain, don't judge you, don't make small talk. At least that's what I used to believe. I worked Tuesday and Thursday nights, 1000 p.m. to 600 a.m. My supervisor, Glenn, usually hands me the work orders before heading home. The Thursday night was no different. 3 graves to dig in Section G before the rain hit routine work. By a little after midnight, I'd finished 2 of them. I was heading back to prep for the 3rd when my phone buzzed with an email from the Yanle Cemetery's administrative system urgent additional work order. That happens sometimes. Unexpected deaths, last-minute scheduling changes. I open it without thinking. Plot G51, service time Friday 1000 a.m. Name David Reyes. My name same, spelling same. Middle initial. My birth date was listed correctly too. What stopped my breathing was the death date the day before. I assumed it was a glitch, a sick coincidence. But then I noticed the family contact number. It was my mother's. I tried calling Glenn. Voicemail, tried the admin office. No answer. It was nearly 1 a.m. I told myself I was being stupid and drove over to plot G51 just to prove it wasn't real. The grave was already dug 6 feet deep, clean edges. Fresh dirt piled neatly beside it. A temporary marker stood at the head of the plot with my name, birth date, and death date printed neatly on it. I don't remember backing away, only realizing I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. Then the emails started coming in, 1 every few seconds more. Work orders. More names, Glenn and admin assistant. A few regular visitors I recognized, all with death dates in the coming days, all scheduled for burial. I turned my phone off and tried to leave. That's when I saw lights on in Section M, excavator lights. Glenn was there digging, or at least someone who looked exactly like him. Same uniform, same posture, but his movements were wrong, stiff, empty. He didn't respond when I shouted his name. Then another excavator started, then another, all across the cemetery. As I ran past sections, I looked at the graves I'd dug earlier. 2 of them were empty. Mine wasn't. Someone was lying in it. Me, same clothes, same boots. Even the tear in my sleeve from the fence I caught it on the week before, when I blinked the grave, was empty again. I locked myself in the maintenance building and called 911. While I waited, I watched the security monitors. The excavators were still running. No operators. Another email came through. One of the names belonged to the responding officer. Death time listed down to the minute. 20 minutes later, I watched his cruiser lose control on the wet grass and wrap itself around an oak tree. Everything after that feels distant, like I was already gone. I quit the next day, Glenn's wife told me. Head died that night, heart attack while driving home. The others followed. Every name from those emails showed up in the obituaries within days. That was 3 weeks ago. I never went back to Hillrest. My mother and I left town. I deleted the email account tied to the cemetery system, but my work order is still burned into my memory. According to it, I died Wednesday night. My funeral was scheduled for Friday morning. I didn't attend, so technically I'm already dead, and lately I've been dreaming of that grave again, lying there staring up at the sky and feeling like I forgot something important, like someone is still waiting for me to come back and finish my shift. Don't know how long this will stay up, or if anyone will even read it, but I've had too much time to think some things eat you alive if you don't let them out. I'm typing this from a questionably obtained phone, sitting in the dark, because what I saw in here doesn't feel like it belongs anywhere in this world. I remember they brought him in on a transfer late one night. He was shackled like the rest of us. His name was read off and forgotten just as fast. He was thin, pale, and just felt off. His eyes kept drifting, never fixing on faces or walls. He looked drugged out of his mind. For the first couple days, nobody really paid him any attention. In a place like this, that silence is safe. Most of the time, at least he'd sit on his bunk for hours, barely breathing. The other thing that stood out was how little he slept, how his eyes would snap open and dart around wildly at the smallest sound. It was odd, moving different directions and moving far faster than any eyes I'd seen by the third day. The shaking started, not like full convulsions, but just this low tremor. Reminded me of my grandma and her epilepsy. People noticed, but people always notice weird stuff. You learn fast not to ask too many questions. Then came the blinking. It was rapid, unnatural, like his eyes were shorting out. A lot joked constantly he was possessed, and a lot of guys laughed. However, an equal amount also kept their distance. The night it happened, I knew it felt wrong from the start. The block was too quiet. Like everyone was waiting for something. I was laying on my bunk when I heard a sound I can never forget. It was wet and tearing like stiff meat being slowly pulled apart. A scream followed, sharp and high, and that's when I looked across the block. His jaw was opening, stretching farther than possible. His jaw popped and rolled like those nature documentaries of those snakes that unhinge their jaws. Skin split along the sides of his mouth, and something black pushed through slick like oil, and moving like it had joints in too many places. Like every single point along its spine, arms, and legs were 20-jointed somehow. It crawled out of him, folding and unfolding itself as it dropped to the floor with a heavy, wet thud. It was as if it was both solid and liquid. The man's hollow skin slumped backward, empty, like a grain sack emptied and tossed aside. The thing didn't hesitate. It launched itself at the nearest guy, wrapping itself around his face. There was this absolutely awful muffled scream and gurgle as he went down. The man clawed and scraped at his face as he fell back, blood rolling down the wall as he slammed into it. Sounded like a watermelon being stomped on. He just started shaking and then spasming. That's when I realized it wasn't hurting him or externally anyways. It was moving, passing itself along, testing out a new body. By the time the guards came rushing in, it had already jumped again to another larger inmate. Batons and firearms were used as the alarm screamed. But it didn't care. The lights flickered, the power seemingly failing. It slipped away in the chaos somehow. When the lights finally came up, 3 guards were on the floor, tore to shreds, arms looking shredded cheese or ground hamburger. The next day, they said it was drugs. They said it was a psychotic episode that turned violent. They scrubbed the floors over and over and over and moved people around like fucking furniture. Anyone who talked too much got sent somewhere else solitary if I had to guess. I tried to talk about it once, but was promptly beat within an inch of my life by the old hands. The message was silent but painfully clear, so I kept my mouth shut. I still do. That's how you survive, right? But sometimes at night, I still see the blinking in other inmates, the little twitches and convulsions they try to hide, and my stomach sinks. Always makes my blood run cold. All the other old hands have died or disappeared, and sometimes I think the guards know more that they allow. It's a run rampant. I don't know what that thing was or where it came from, but I don't think it ever really left this place. All I know for sure is it wore a man like a goddamn coat and discarded him when it was done. I don't think he'll ever sleep well again.